Welcome to Stanford Legal, where we look at the cases, questions, conflicts, and legal stories that affect us all every day. I'm Pam Karlan, along with Joe Bankman. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Pam.
So, Joe, we live in Silicon Valley, and yet we know so little about some aspects of it. And our guests today are going to talk to us about one of the least known aspects, in a way, of Silicon Valley.
That's right. We're going to talk about venture capital. And the venture capitalists, in a way, they're the kind of kings and queens, or the royalties, I think, of Silicon Valley. But the focus today is going to be what it takes to be a royal in Silicon Valley if you're female. What is the role of women in venture capitalists? And we have someone who's written a terrific book, Julian Guthrie, and she's going to talk to us about some women pioneers in Silicon Valley.
That's right. The book is called Alpha Girls, the Women Upstarts Who Took on Silicon Valley's Male Culture and Made the Deals of a Lifetime. And I think one of the things that we're going to talk about with you that really struck me is when we talk about deals of a lifetime, I think that's almost a double-edged statement in the book, because you're talking about both about the deals themselves and the lifetimes and how those deals and lifetimes interact.
Well, and also these were huge deals and significant companies, and few people realize there were key women behind these companies, behind really these industries, if you will. So I think it's an interesting subtitle, interesting title for the book.
And you're not our only guest today.
We have with us one of the pioneers of venture capital, MJ Elmore, who's been a funder of a lot. How many companies would you say that you see your footprints on, MJ?
Probably 40 or 50.
40 or 50 companies. And
she's one of the protagonists of the book, we should say, which really kind of uses the stories of four women of slightly different ages and who had somewhat different roles, both how they came into Silicon Valley and what they did while they were here. It's a fascinating book.
Yeah, their stories, the women, their stories are very different. Where they came from, their backstories, their family stories. I write in a very novelistic way. So you get to know about their family lives and their hopes and dreams and the challenges and the successes, the broadsides. But the women are very different. So there's MJ, who we are meeting here today, and there's Teresa Gao, there is Sonia Howell Perkins, and Magdalena Yashil. And interestingly, since we're at Stanford, 3 of the 4 graduated from Stanford.
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting. And one of the things is you do get a sense of how different the routes the women took to being here were. And yet they also experienced some very common issues, both in their work lives and in the relationship between their work lives and their private lives.
Well, I wanted to take these 4 stories, and while they are very different women with different backstories, with different even investment methodologies, approaches, outcomes, the women had a lot of commonalities. It's interesting because the women for many years working on Sand Hill Road, within maybe over in the next building, didn't necessarily know one another because there weren't the networks that we have today. But I wanted to tell the story of these 4 young women arriving in Silicon Valley with shared dreams. So you talk about their commonalities and the shared dream of really making it in tech. And they didn't know necessarily that it was this by all accounts, a very inhospitable place for women. And maybe not knowing that or not thinking about that when they set out on this journey in some way helped them. So there are these commonalities that they have. But yet, a uniqueness to each. And I feel like collectively, it's a really fascinating tapestry when taken as a whole.
MJ, let's start with your story. Here you are, you're working at Intel, which itself is kind of a male place, I imagine, at the
Absolutely.
time. And you leave this male place, you get, I think the description is, you get Andy Grove to to kind of bless you for leaving, but he thinks you're going to Stanford Business School. He thinks that's BS anyway, but he's willing to kind of give you his blessing, and then you get a job with a venture capital firm. Tell us about what it was like to try to get that first job there.
So I was at the Stanford Business School in my second year and thinking about what I wanted to do next. And I really planned to go back into Silicon Valley into a marketing job. I loved marketing, and I planned to do that. But that season, there were quite a bit of growth in the venture business and quite a few venture firms looking to add. And so I was one of the few people in my class at the business school who had that technical background. I had that background from Intel, so I got invitations to interview. And I knew the firm Institutional Venture Partners. I knew IVP up on Sand Hill Road, and so I was setting up some of my own interviews, and I decided to go up there and interview with Reed Dennis, who's one of the deans of the venture business. And my friend said, I don't know why you would ever want to interview with Reed Dennis. He'd never hire a woman. And I said, well, it'll be good practice anyway, and who knows. So I did go up and interviewed with him, and we had a great time. And when I went to leave, he said, I wish you wouldn't go. And I said, why is that? And he said, well, there's a group coming in. I don't like to meet with teams by myself. So I said, okay, I'll stay. So I stayed, and we met with a group of entrepreneurs. And before I left, I had a job.
So you might want to explain, because I know some of our listeners, some of our audience is obviously in Silicon Valley. We have a lot of alums who listen to the show. But what exactly does a venture capitalist do?
Well, people think of it as people think of it as a very financial type job. It's really not high finance. It's more about finding teams of people with great ideas and great market opportunities who can start that next company that's going to experience really high growth. And the financial part of it is all what we call very vanilla. All these deals look very much the same. So, it's really trying to be as early as possible into the next great idea.
MJ, when you tell us that people say, don't do it, you'll never get the job, and you'll say, well, I'll have a good experience. It'll be a learning experience. I sense this is character logical for you. You're someone that says, I'll give things a try. Is that right? Is that how you see yourself?
Well, I have a math background. I think of math as a way of thinking, and it's a logical way of thinking. And so if you're going to find a job in venture capital, you're going to pick up a lot of rocks and put them down, and it's a process. So I really thought this was just a step in the process and I'd learn a lot.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with our guests, Julian Guthrie and MJ Elmore, about venture capital and women in Silicon Valley, and the book that Julian wrote and that MJ appears in, Alpha Girls. Joe?
I want to continue with your story just a little bit, MJ. So when you're doing this, you have a math background being at Intel. There's not many women there in tech. Now you're at a venture firm. Did the math background kind of make it easier to be a trailblazer for you, or were you conscious of that kind of every moment? What was it like in those early days when I imagine you look around and you'd see no other women that were in kind of management jobs?
Well, that's right. And Reed and I ended up hiring a team of people, and they were all men. And to make matters worse, I don't think any of the men had working wives. So I was a little bit like a third sex to these guys. They didn't know, what to think of me. And their social network, I'm sure those wives didn't work either. So I was someone that they were really, trying to figure out how was this going to work. I mean, they were very good to me, but and so there were when I'd go also to the companies. There's a story in the book about one of the first board meetings I ever went to. I walked in the room, and every man in the room said how cute I looked. And I thought, well, that's not really what I'm going for here. I'm really looking to be find the best deals and make the best investment. So I completely changed the way I looked. I cut my hair. I started wearing really drab gray suits, and there's some pictures of me in the middle of the book where I look like one of the guys.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I thought was interesting is the number of times people were asked in the course of the book to get coffee for somebody. I thought that was almost like a kind of refrain in the book, that the assumption was the women in the room were only assistants. And one of the other things I thought was really interesting in the book is the number of times you talked to the assistants of the women that you were profiling in the book, and how they were almost like a sort of outside a Greek chorus, if you will, observing what was happening with the principals.
Well, it's all, it's like when you're creating anything, when you're making a film, and in this case, writing a book, you want as many perspectives as possible. You want to corroborate the story, the scene, add details to it. So I did. I went to the assistants, I went to the partners, or in some cases the spouses, and to the children, the grown children, and just to kind of get a sense of, from all different perspectives, which I always think is important, to recreate a scene as I did. This is a reconstructive narrative. So, it starts in the 1970s and brings us up to today.
So one of the things that I kind of wondered about in the book, obviously the book is designed to be about the alpha girls. So you never mention the omega girls, the ones who didn't make it. I mean, there's very little discussion of them. Did you get a sense from writing the book what accounted for the women who made it versus the women who didn't?
I did. And, you referenced the getting, would you get me some coffee? And that was a common refrain or mistake that people made of these really successful women at various stages in their careers, even, when they were phenomenally successful. But how they dealt with it is more interesting to me. It's interesting that it still happened to them. It's wrong. But it's, there's an assumption, there's a stereotype, there's some gender bias involved. But I was more interested in what was their response. And for most of the women, it was not to take offense at that. It was not to raise issue with it. It was to either laugh it off, or it was, to say, as Sandy Kurtzig did when she first visited Stanford for a class with MJ, she was the first woman to take a tech company public, and she was in a meeting, and she was the CEO of the company, and one of the clients, the male clients, asked her if she would go get coffee, and everybody looked, mortified because he didn't know who she was, and she said, "Sure, and if I'll get you coffee, and if we do this deal, I'll bake you cookies." So, controversial maybe today, although I think it speaks to, again, a commonality that the women had, which was knowing when to take issue with something and when to let it go. A clueless remark like this was not intended to harm. And so it was eyes on the prize. It was, what do I want to achieve here? It's more important that I get this deal than it is, that I point out, this person's mistake and humiliate him.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with our guests about Alpha Girl, a book about the women who made it big in Silicon Valley. Joe?
Julian, I noticed when you were talking and answering Pam about what do you do when someone says, get coffee. MJ, I noticed you were about to speak before. So tell us what you were thinking.
Well, just a couple of thoughts. I mean, there is a lot being written still today about these housekeeping jobs in companies. And there's the real business of what you're doing. And there's a lot of things on the periphery that really could be considered housekeeping, and that how important it is for women to not fall into the trap of taking those on because they want to be liked and they want to be useful. I was smiling. I heard a quote by the notorious RBG. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was in Berkeley last week, I believe, and she said her mother-in-law gave her some great advice, and it was really about marriage, but she used it also with her colleagues, and the advice was, sometimes it's useful just to be a little bit deaf.
Well, I remember I've been on a couple of panels with Justice Ginsburg over the years, and I remember one at which they were asking all of us on the panel sort of what were your most important life decisions, and Justice Ginsburg said the most important life decision and career decision you have as a woman is who your partner is going to be, because in her case, Marty Ginsburg, who both Joe and I know, was not only a very supportive partner of her ambitions, but also handled the cooking, handled a lot of the child raising and the like. And this was one of the parts of the book that I found most interesting was either women married quite late in the book, had their children quite late. A number of the marriages broke up that you wrote about in the book. One of the most powerful parts of the book was one of your four protagonists wanted to take a medical leave and was told, you can take family leave, but no sabbatical for you. I mean, did you get a sense that these things had changed over time? Because at least in the sequence in the book, things did not seem to me to be getting better over the course of that period. And it didn't seem as if the partners were becoming more supportive of the women. If anything, the success of some of your female protagonists seemed to cause problems in their relationships rather than avoid those problems.
Well, I think that's common across industries where women become super successful and maybe outshine their partners, their spouses. And it's it's something that the couple has to grapple with in terms of who does what roles. But I think that, whether it is with money, whether it's with childcare, whether it's the domestic responsibilities, which are always unequal, it's something that needs to be navigated. And it was an interesting part of this book in terms of, their personal lives and how do they navigate, again, this really tricky terrain of venture capital and of being, the only woman at the table or one of the only women. At the same time, then you go home, you're the go-to parent, you get the calls at work, you are doing all of these things that women, these, as MJ was describing, the non-working spouses or wives of her partners. So it was really tricky terrain. And the women didn't, again, have this network then either, which has made it much better for women today. So there are changes today. There's still some of the very same issues that, even when the narrative starts, a lot of those same issues exist today.
I remember, MJ, in your part of the book, when your then husband went to sleep, you're described as, now I do the chores that a stay-at-home wife might have been doing from 3 to 4 in the afternoon. When you hear us talk about that, do you see a lot of progress, or do you think women are still doing that? How do you hear this?
I see some progress. I think, there's a metric that's being thrown out is that women are doing 90 minutes more per day of the unpaid work at home. I think that's an underestimate of how much they do when you add some of the, not just the actual time, but some of the mental load that they carry. But I think young women today are thinking, are maybe negotiating more with their spouses ahead of time of what it's going to look like when they have a family, and asking their spouses to do more of their fair share. I still think it's not even, but I think we've made some progress.
We'll be back with more from our guests talking about Alpha Girls next on Stanford Legal here on Sirius XM Insight 121. Welcome back to Stanford Legal, where we look at the cases, questions, conflicts, and legal stories that affect us all every day. I'm Pam Karlan, along with Joe Bankman. Joe?
Hi, Pam. We were talking before our break about the old days in Silicon Valley, and so I guess the question now is, have things changed? And let me ask you this, Julian. What do you think?
So when I started the reporting for my book, Alpha Girls, 94% of all check writing VCs were men. But that made me think, well, who are the 6%? And that led me to these extraordinary women. But so that was only a couple of years ago. In that time, the Me Too movement happened. I started my reporting before that was really, that really galvanized great change internationally across industries. So now I think the number is closer to 8% of all check writing VCs are women. So it's moved incrementally. The other really significant, important statistic is only 2% of VC dollars historically have gone to women-founded firms, and so 2%, that's all. And that also is changing, but again, incrementally. And what's changing it is, and there are great stories in the book about these women who I write about who did not have connections, who did not have a network, have now created these powerful networks for women investors and women founders. And so the dynamics are changing because of that. With just a couple of the groups that I write about in the book, the funding level for women-founded firms has gone from the standard, which I said is 2%, to 50-some% of the investing dollars going to women-founded firms. So these pockets of promise and hope exist.
2 to 50%?
Yes, yes.
Of all of the dollars that are now going to...
No, with these particular, with a
these
couple
women.
of these platforms, investing platforms like Broadway Angels, Plum Alley, where now they're about over half of their investing dollars are going to women-founded firms. And compare that to the industry standard. That was the point I was making of only 2%. So there are these pockets of promise, and VC firms are hiring more diversity, and that's in gender as well. But my hope is that this is not when the spotlight is on, and that this is not a matter of tokenism. Okay, we have one woman on the board, check. We can check that box and we can move on, and time will tell with that. But we're missing this huge opportunity when there is such a lack of diversity.
I mean, one of the things I found really interesting in the book, MJ, is your investing strategy changed. That is, what kinds of companies you want to invest in. And you might want to say a little bit about that, because I found it a kind of fascinating shift.
Well, when I began investing on my own as an angel, and you can do anything you want when you're investing your own funds, and so I've tried to align my personal interests with my investments, and make no mistake, venture investing is not easy, and it's really quite easy to lose a lot of money. One of the things I'm having the most fun with right now is I think the last 5 or 6 deals I've done have all had women founders.
Yeah, one of the things that you started off our conversation at the very beginning of the program with was you said, people don't understand that venture capital is not just about the money you put in. And I wonder if you might turn to that second piece of what you do as a VC.
Well, after what you do as a VC, I mean, the ways you spend your time would be trying to source, picking some areas of interest. Typically at a venture firm, the different players will have pockets of industry expertise and interest. And so try to see every deal that gets started in a particular segment. And then, so sourcing deals. And then you're meeting with these entrepreneurs and trying to understand what the premise is of their new business. And then you're doing due diligence to see if it's a good idea or not. You're looking at the technology, you're looking at the people, you're looking at the markets, you're looking at the how much money it's going to really take. And then ultimately, if you make a decision to invest, you structure this deal, which I described as being somewhat vanilla, and then you're working with the companies on the boards.
Yeah, and on the boards is another area where women have traditionally not served at anywhere near their rate in the population.
And I wonder, I'm really struck by something you said, Julian, which is when women have the power and have their firms, they fund differently and wildly differently. 50% of their money is going to women as against 2%, which shows us just how important it is to kind of control that, or at least not be out of control on that. I think being on the board is kind of similar. That is, putting people at the top makes a difference all the way down.
And before you answer that, let me just remind our listeners that this is Stanford Legal, and we're talking with Julian Guthrie about her book, Alpha Girls. So, to quote Hamilton, people want to be in the room where it happens. And I guess maybe boards are one of the rooms where it happens.
I think so, but there is, as you were mentioning, there is this affinity bias that happens and has happened historically, where men are funding men who look very much like themselves. Well, maybe we can turn the tables and women will have the same affinity bias and will be funding companies that are started by women who look like themselves. And that is starting to happen. But it's really bringing in just a diverse array of ideas, whether it's with gender, or much more needs to happen with gender, and with racial, ethnic diversity as well. So again, I think there are pockets of promise. I think the numbers are still pretty dire in my mind. This book was a real wake-up call for me to how women succeed, where we are, where we are not. And this is across industries, whether it is in technology or law or medicine or construction, any number of industries where their stories, the stories I got to tell, are very relatable and they translate. Oh, go ahead, Jeff.
MJ, I know that you have some advice you would give to women that are trying to negotiate, say, the venture world today. I want to give you an opportunity to give them the benefit of your experience.
Well, if you enter a field that's male-dominated, if you're the only woman in the room, you do have to think about a strategy for how you're going to survive being that alien or third sex that you might be considered. But one thing I tell young women is to, really try to understand the power structure as it exists, not what you wish it was. What are the dynamics of the firm, and to take that as a given, and then go and let your performance speak for itself, and to build on that performance. And one way I think you can do that is to start with what you know, like anything else. Start with what you know. And when I was came from Intel, as we talked about, and I had worked in an area called design automation, so tools that allow you to design with Intel microprocessors. So when I got to IVP, I made that one of my areas of expertise, was that I really knew the design automation area and I knew everybody in it, so I had a network there. So start with what you know. And secondly, I talk about finding a unique point of view, something that you maybe know that the other partners in the firm don't. And in my case, I was the one who really talked most about markets and marketing.
So do you have advice for people other than, once they sort of know what they know, how are there different strategies that women should be using than men should be using to negotiate inside the firm?
Well, we talked about not volunteering for the housekeeping jobs that are being offered your way. And I think having a strong sense of humor is important. I talked about being deaf, a little bit deaf at times, and cultivating allies. Cultivating allies at work is really important, especially with the males. I mean, sometimes all it really takes is you're in a room and you're talking. You just want one other person in the room to be nodding their head or saying yes. And, if you know you're going into an important meeting and you can get one of your male allies, ask them ahead of time to back you up.
We've been talking here with MJ Elmore and Julian Guthrie about the alpha girls and women who have kind of helped make Silicon Valley what it is. And Pam, I know that in this interview, we had a lot of thoughts about how this could be applied to law. But in fact, your stories have been so engrossing, we haven't gotten to all of them. But I hope at some other time maybe we can, and you'll come back and we can bounce legal ideas off you, including the role of law in the venture capital world.
So thank you, Julian, and thank you, MJ, and thanks to our listeners for joining us on Stanford Law here on Sirius XM Insight 121.